At its core, the male-initiated pressure for some Muslim societies to use collective shame was back then, and still is to this day, a weapon to subjugate women. The face veil is not a curtain, as some supporters euphemistically characterize it. It's purely and simply a public poster that says, I've given in to the males in my family and my culture who choose to blame women for their aggressive sexual tendencies. The Quran states, in a translation agreed to by both Islamic and Arab language scholars, in the only verse used to justify why Muslim women should cover their hair or faces, that's in verse 24:31, and tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their private parts, and not expose their adornment except that which necessarily appears thereof, and to wrap a portion of their covers over their bosom, and not expose their adornment except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women, or their slaves, whom their right hand possess, or old male servants who lack vigor, or small children, sometimes interpreted as boys, who have no sense of the shame of sex, or alternatively, of a naked woman's body. And let them not stamp their feet to make known what they conceal of their adornment. What's really interesting is that many modern translations reinterpret the actual words in the Quran to make it sound like cover really meant head cover. It does not. That lower their gaze really means reduce their vision, meaning they should cover their eyes with a mesh face mask, and that slaves just meant servants. And these misinterpretations are literally among thousands of similar misinterpretations designed to make the actual words and intentions of the Quran sound more acceptable in the modern world. Yeah, no, I'm not buying it. For 900 years after Muhammad died, there were no written books filled with quotes from the Prophet, just the word-of-mouth tradition of holy men recounting what they'd been told, or their own interpretations of what they'd been told by what the warlord had claimed that God had told him. I worked in Saudi Arabia, and I can tell you that, number one, the type of guy who memorizes the Quran in order to become an imam is the type of guy who wants to spend a lifetime up in front of a large group of people and lord it over them, interpreting what is in the Quran in a way that gives him power and authority. And that's what so-called Sharia law means. Just an imam doling out his version of justice based on his personal interpretation of the Quran. It's been a long time since I last did a video, but as I'm gearing up to launch a new channel called The End of Us, Why Humanity Won't Survive Human Nature, I thought I'd put this one out to re-hone my video production skills. I'm going to read you a still relevant blog post of mine. Here's a thought on Canada's acceptance of the hijab, the hair covering scarf, the niqab, the hair and face covering veil, and the burqa, the head-to-toe cloak. I wrote this blog post on Human Nature Simplified at blogspot.com back in 2012, but things haven't changed, if not gotten a lot worse in our current Justin Trudeau-led woke culture, now over a decade later. It's really not about multiculturalism and being broad-minded. It's about the underlying principles of accepting repressive and backward impositions into our progressive Canadian culture. If it's okay to toss out centuries of carefully evolved Canadian freedoms for one group, where does it stop? Does polygamous marriage suddenly become okay? Beating women isn't so bad. Keeping a household slave is fine if that's what you're used to. I had this to say on Maclean Magazine's site in response to their January 17, 2012 article about the wearing of the face veil in Canada. Having lived and worked in the Middle East, I think the main point is that for Canada to accept the covering of one group of religious followers' faces means that our society is accepting the philosophy behind it. The notion that if a woman does not cover herself, her femininity, her attractive face, it is her fault if men want her and cannot control themselves, i.e. not the man's fault assault. While some Muslim women do this because of their interpretation of the Quran, many do it because the men in their society label them as loose women and bad Muslims for not covering up. That's a pretty powerful weapon, I'd say, to fight against, being labeled a slut and a societal failure every day by everyone around you. The reality is that just a few decades ago, a generation who are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was virtually no face covering going on. Before oil made the entire nations in the Arab states wealthy enough to quit being nomadic camel herders There was far too much work to be done for women to cover their faces. This is a new imposition from imams who want to be known for making new and ever more stringent proclamations, even more conservative interpretations of the Quran. Some years back in Saudi Arabia, the commonplace baring of hands and feet suddenly became taboo, and many women began wearing socks and gloves in the 50+ Celsius degree heat. Note that there is nothing, not anywhere in the Quran, that states the color of any of these modest articles of clothing be black. Black was imposed upon women in Saudi because it discourages women from going out in sunlight. When the temperature goes up to 70 degrees Celsius in the sun, even wearing black pants is a painful experience. I can attest to that. All the men wear white, thin cotton garments that shelter them from the sun while being as cool to wear as possible. Like the work that the Catholic bishops are doing behind the scenes to give themselves the semblance of power and an excuse to mingle with high rollers, when we go along with whatever some control-obsessed males have cooked up under the guise of religion just to be politically correct or sensitive, we are actually opening the door to much more radicalization. Many new Canadians, having come from totally repressed, censored countries, revel in their rights once they become citizens in Canada to protest being offended by everything they come across. It's like being a kid in a candy store and they snicker at the way the rest of their fellow Canadians rush to apologize and give in to their claims of having been offended against. This multicultural melting pot that Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that's Justin's late father, began has gone out of control to the point where Canada is losing any clear heritage. It's being whitewashed to avoid offending newcomers. Net, this face covering thing is, in most of the Arab world, a new imposition, not a consistent thing stretching back millennia, despite what many of the imams and Muslims will try to convince you of. For Canada to roll over on it would be a violation of our core values, that men and women are equal. Wear what you like, shave your head, never cut your sideburns, but when it comes to hiding your identity, you should be required to expose your face to any person who asks you to do so. Everywhere in our free country, just as men walking into a bank or a courthouse wearing a ski mask would be asked to do. The real issue, when we are talking about fundamentalism in any religion, Catholicism, evangelical Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, is that while sticking to the strict rule book is immensely pleasurable and reassuring for many obsessive-compulsive, change-averse types, the rules and regulations written into these books were relevant thousands of years ago. The message of doing the right thing versus doing whatever we selfishly would prefer to do has eternal relevance. But the majority of people in every society use religion as a guideline for their lives, for their behaviors. They don't see it in absolutes. And over time, open-mindedness has begun to take over in what were formerly very repressive cultures. There will always be individual men with psychopathic tendencies that I now refer to as malignant narcissism, who will try to hijack ancient religious writings as an excuse for doing the things they really enjoy doing, like tossing acid in the face of women, raping them, or controlling them in other ways. But the majority of people get that these ancient historical documents have lost their relevance and they no longer abide by them word for word. It's time for modern societies like Canada to stop tiptoeing around recent immigrants' demands to never change and refuse to assimilate. It's time to say, these are the modern, open-minded, fair, and egalitarian rules of Canadian society, your new country's morals/ethics that are the foundation of providing you and your family with a better life and more freedom. Sorry, but if you are so keen on not changing, on not accepting Canada's view of humanity, then return home and stay there. I can assure you that if I visit your country, I will not break your country's codes of conduct and I will respect your cultural traditions. Just because the Quran happened to be written at a time when it was common to keep slaves, interesting that you don't hear about Muslims using all of the mentions of slaves in the Quran as justification for enslaving people, although there are literally tens of thousands of household slaves in the Middle East today within those impenetrable walled family compounds. It doesn't mean that today it's okay for slavery to be enshrined in Islamic countries' constitutions. The issue of repression of women is identical. It was commonplace and accepted as part of life 2,000 years ago. It no longer is. That is what the hijab, niqab, and burqa are all about. The world's largest religion saying that because this book, the central tenet of our religion, was written at a time that it was okay to enslave people and for men to blame women for stirring up male sexual desires, we have to stick to it word for word thousands of years later. Not cool. Our species has evolved socially. We've learned many new things. Humans of every stripe have to live differently together today than we did thousands of years ago. The sheer volume of humans on the planet now necessitates it. You can still embrace the core message of Islam without adhering to its ancient prejudices. And the veil is an extremely public display of the idea that if women do not cover up their attractive bits, it's their own fault if they get sexually attacked. At its core, the male-initiated pressure for some Muslim societies to use collective shame was back then, and still is to this day, a weapon to subjugate women. The face veil is not a curtain, as some supporters euphemistically characterize it. It's purely and simply a public poster that says, I've given in to the males in my family and my culture who choose to blame women for their aggressive sexual tendencies. It also says, we new Canadians do not trust Canadian laws, police, and the judicial system to keep us safe and grant us the same freedoms as women from other cultures. Covering my face is a symbol of my family and culture's ongoing support for our old country's moral values and laws that put women in jail if they allow themselves, quote unquote, to be raped and then force them to marry the rapist. Yeah, that's what they do. And let me clarify something. So-called Sharia law is not some ancient holy law book that so many power-hungry imams want to impose upon Muslims. It is merely demanding that those same imams who never went through any school or set of exams for accreditation. Note that to become an imam, one merely needs to memorize the Quran in Arabic word for word. Those same imams will be granted the power to use their own personal interpretation of the words in the Quran to pass highly individualistic judgment on whatever transgressions are presented to them. This is Canada in the 21st century. It's not your fault if you're beautiful. It's mine if I decide to attack you. Cover your hair if you like the religious symbolism. But you don't have to fear being attacked or ostracized for having the freedom from male repression to be seen for who you are in this country. You are not a slut for not veiling your face. You're a modern Canadian citizen living in our supposedly free society. Be proud of that and reject this public display of male oppression of women. And remember, my fellow students of human nature, you aren't doing YouTube right if you aren't clicking on the thumbs up button down here for every single video that you got even a little bit out of, and you're not subscribing to every channel you watch more than once. And you can be subscribed to more than 1,000 channels. Nothing weird is going to happen in your feed if you do so. Turning on notifications, commenting, and sharing are even more effective ways to say thanks and help content creators get more views and subscribers. If this or any of my videos or blog posts made you think a little bit differently about human nature, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com of The End of Us, or buy me a coffee in the links below. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you on my new channel, The End of Us, and website, theendofus.ca. See you in the next video.